Hi, Matt. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing well, out in nature and enjoying the weather. So today I'm
Very good.
with you, Matthew Gold, a virtuoso percussionist and an artist in residence at Williams College. And you direct the Williams Percussion Ensemble as well as the annual Festival of New Music. With this background, we thought it would be interesting to ask you for some personal insight into some aspects of the idea of noise in modern music, as well as percussive feelings more generally. So you're a percussionist for the Talia Ensemble, a group of 19 New York City classically trained musicians, comprising also of electronics, woodwind, brass, and string players, and pianists. Talia has been lauded for its immaculate virtuosity by the Washington Post. In my email introduction to you also, you were introduced as a virtuoso. So on this note, I was wondering if you can marry for us the concepts of virtuosity and noise making.
Sure. Well, thank you, Youssef, for that introduction. And yeah, this is a great question, and there's a lot to go into here. I guess to begin with the idea of virtuosity, um, I think we have a conventional idea of what virtuosity means out of the whole body of certainly Western concert music. Um, and it means a certain facility on an instrument as well as with the musical material and the like. But I think, as I think about your question, I think what you're getting at is that maybe virtuosity is different in contemporary music, and specifically as it relates to percussion and noise, or at least the possibility of that. And yeah, like on a basic level, percussion, virtuosity, and noise, maybe a place to start is to say we can make a lot of noise. We can make like tremendously large sounds. And there is something virtuosic to that. There's a physical component to creating these sounds on our instruments. It's not just playing loud, but generating sound, like a deep level of sound, a very full spectrum of sound. Um, so that is, something that we do and is part of our relationship with our instruments and with music and with sound. But I think, thinking about virtuosity and noise, maybe a little bit beyond that, I'd say that like, maybe I'd want to talk about how like the role of noise in percussion playing first and how that would then apply to virtuosity. And this is something I've been thinking about a lot lately. Actually, noise has been on my mind very much. In fact, it's often on my mind, but especially lately. I've been thinking about percussion less in terms of the kind of designations than the different divisions of instruments that we usually employ, keyboard percussion instruments, non-pitch percussion instruments, found sounds, standardized instruments, and thinking like trying to think about how to classify them. And I've been thinking of that in terms of noise and signal. Um, and I feel like there's a spectrum from, let's say, a marimba, where the purpose of the instrument is to provide pitch or harmonic content. And that's really thought of as signal, something that you're meant to hear exactly as it's written or as it's conceived, to instruments that are noisier, where the signal, the attack, the thing that you might see in the score actually has all kinds of complex things going on, things that we think of as noise, things that we, in a lot of ways, don't want to hear. And this complicates the picture for a percussionist, especially when you're playing a group of instruments that integrate those different things. How do you, on the one hand, project the signal, the things that are intended to be heard, even in a marimba, which is, despite the fact that it's arranged as a keyboard percussion instrument, like a piano and has clear pitches, it's a beast of an instrument with all these strange overtones and all kinds of resonances. And so one way virtuosity comes up in percussion is being able to navigate all that noise and shape it into something that can be perceived and can be clearly heard. As a signal, as a phrase, as a melody, as a harmony. But I think I'm actually more interested in the other way, like all those noises, all that depth of sound in these percussion instruments, all the strange overtones, the inharmonic qualities, and the things that we generally think of as noise, the things that we might tend to want to block out. And so getting in a very, very roundabout way to answer your question, I think that maybe virtuosity in contemporary percussion music has a lot to do with how you shape noise, how you dig into the things that are maybe generally thought of as the unwanted characteristics or the overlooked characteristics of a percussion instrument. Not just the attack of the cymbal, but all the overtones that happen afterwards, the resonance, the decay, the sustain, the release, all those really complicated, interesting things. And even going beyond what the instrument might have been intended for, to the surface features, the rough quality of it, the way you interact with it, so that virtuosity in contemporary percussion involves taking a thing and saying, what does this do? How can I do that? What do I do with it? And exploring this deep well of sound in order to bring the instrument to life. So I think that's certainly an aspect of virtuosity and noise, the ability to, or the interest in even exploring that noise and using it to make something new.
So is it kind of like directing noise is a way to look at it?
It can be directing noise. It can be combining noises. Like, I think drum set, I started out as a drum set player, and drum set has always informed my approach to percussion, in the sense of taking these disparate objects and, again, getting past the attack points, the signal, like, a bell, when it's notated in a contemporary piece, it might just be an attack, but then there are all the things that happen afterwards. On drum set, that's kind of taken as a given. You take these disparate things, drums really from all different parts of the world, different drums, cymbals also from different places that came together as one instrument in, really the American South in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, and then developed its own performance practice. And so when you hit a cymbal, you might double it with the bass drum. The sound of the buzzing of the snare as it reacts to other parts of the set in sympathetic vibration. And then as a drummer, you create things with that. So you navigate your way through the noise, you control it, but you also build combinations of things that really are noises. They're not the initial attack, but all the things that happen afterwards, all those resonances and vibrations. And that's what you're playing. And sometimes you're controlling it, sometimes you're riding it or just taking part in it, which is a very powerful thing too. But I think the virtuosity of a contemporary percussionist goes beyond just playing fast. There's certainly a physical component to it, and sometimes it is just playing fast, which we spend many, many years practicing. But it's going into the deeper elements of these sounds and the things they do and working with those.
I think it's really important that you kind of give a historical context of it, because we sometimes make the mistake of thinking of noise as like a very 21st century thing. But it's, as you were describing, it's kind of been there. It's always if you want to add on to that.
Sure. Every musical instrument or the voice, there's noise involved. It's of course not just a 21st or 20th century thing. Certainly, the more modern age, the 20th century, the noise of industry in the city and all those things played a huge part in the development of 20th century music and percussion music. But I guess to step back for a moment, when we define noise, in musical terms, it's generally thought to be something that's, like has an irregular set of overtones that's not periodic in the way that like a pitch is. And so it's not as easily controlled, or it doesn't, register a signal in the same way. But really noise is just anything that we don't want to hear, the thing that we want to block out. And that's generally how we understand noise, even in a musical setting. And so I think that what's changed about our understanding of noise in 21st and 20th century music is the way we've allowed all those other sounds that we wanted to block out to come in and to be, a central part of music making. John Cage, of course, has been such an influence on percussion music and our approach to playing and to listening. But if we take this idea of his influence on our listening, I think that plays a big part in this, not just, the performing aspects, but the listening aspects. And once we start listening to noise and the other things our instruments do, and then the things around us, then our idea of what music is changes. But, again, to go back to like, let's say 19th century music, classical music, there are all kinds of noises in the strings and the winds and the like, but I think they're understood to be part of the sound of the instrument. Some aren't, like a wind player, releasing their spit valve or whatever, a brass player, those things you hear on stage that maybe the audience is not meant to hear. But all these instruments have noises and is part of their character. But the field of that has expanded so much that now it's a question of how do you actually make those noises part of your vocabulary of music making. And all the other instruments have to deal with that too. If you think of like all the sounds in like Lachenmann and composers like that, where they've built a really rich vocabulary out of the noises, the non-musical sounds. And we've trained our ears to listen to those as well. But I like to think that percussion has been a leader in that and in transforming the entire sphere of music to lead us towards thinking of those things and listening to those things. Because it is such a central part of our sound. But again, just to go back, to an earlier point, I think that there were a lot of things that we think of as music now, and even percussion instruments that we immediately understand as music, that people thought of noise not that long ago because they just weren't interested or open to hearing them.
Thank you.
And, there are cultural aspects of that too, that, now that I'm thinking about it, part of the noise in an instrument beyond its initial signal is like the meaning it carries, like something that goes, a historical or a cultural meaning in it. This is part of like the collected understanding of the instrument, is part of its noise, its being. And, being open to where sounds come from and recognizing something or incorporating something that you might not have recognized as music initially has absolutely been a central part of the process of percussion music and contemporary music.
So there's a sort of new openness, or a different kind of openness at least.
I think so. I mean, of course, one then has to ask what we're closing our ears to too.
Yeah.
You never know. Like, we all have our blind spots. But I think there are a lot of things, historical circumstances, technological changes, cultural changes that have created a much more open field for noise and the ability to listen to it. I think recordings have done that as well. I imagine that there was a time when it would have been very strange to hear music that you weren't also seeing, where you could see who and what was producing it, to hear something on a recording where you don't know like what's creating the sounds. I think that's an important part of pop music too, where a lot of the instruments are manipulated, processed, overdubbed, or even just created in the studio. Getting used to not knowing what the source of a sound is has opened our ears or made us more open to that kind of dislocation, which I think is very powerful.
I want to turn now to percussive feelings. So more than other instruments, I think something like the marimba has a very large range of motion for the player. And naturally, the writing for percussionists is often rhythmically explorative. So as a player in your body, you experience a rich movement with a lot of overlapping coordination. I'm getting at something neuroscientists call it auditory vestibular interactions. So you have a perception of your own body position, you have perception of your own movement, of your own balance, and this interacts with your auditory system. People that feel no need to complicate things just call this dancing. As the player of the music, you're always in time with yourself. I guess maybe not with things you don't directly, but you're relatively in time with yourself. So like the music is less likely ambiguous for you than it is for the listener. So ambiguity seems to be a desired effect for some music. But can you talk a little about the subjective experience of a percussionist playing modern music and how it may differ or be the same from a modern listener's experience?
Sure. I think there's a lot in there. Maybe I'll try to work backwards, but the subjective experience of it and how it's different for the listener. there are a lot of there are a lot of ways that that happens. One is just perspective. If you are playing in an ensemble piece, then you're hearing the things around you, you're immersed in it. Whereas in a even in contemporary music, in a conventional performance setting where you're on stage, the audience is getting a blended picture that's sent out to them, and that's, I think, the purpose of a concert hall on the stage. Of course, it's really exciting now that we do things outside of that, that we do these
Mhm.
immersive experiences, and I'm really interested in those, because I think I was formed as a listener sitting on stage playing in orchestras, and it's hard for me sometimes to go and listen to an orchestra the way it's meant to be heard.
Mhm.
Like, it's hard not to have those sounds right next to me, to feel the vibrations, to hear from these particular perspectives where everything is spatialized. So, but that said, I think one thing that I've experienced as a performer, um, I talked a little bit previously about how important it is as a musician to listen, even as we're playing, to have our ears open. And I think that we convey a lot to the listener through what we hear when we're on stage, when we're performing, that in some way they hear through our ears. And I think I've had a couple, there are a couple experiences I point to with that for myself. I remember when I was a kid, um, sometimes, riding in the car with my parents, they would let me play my music in the car. And in fairness to them, it was really terrible. I mean, it was very indulgent in them to let me play music that I would not want to listen to now. Um, uh, but they never said a word, and I was sitting in the back seat, so I didn't see their faces. But somehow I felt like I could hear what they didn't like about it, and the music didn't sound as good to me anymore. Like, I'd hear something go, oh, I mean, maybe I wouldn't say like that's cliche or something, I wouldn't have known that then, but I could hear it through their ears. And in a more positive way, the experience of like ending a piece as the last sound fades out, you've struck a cymbal and there's a fermata and you're waiting for that sound to die away. If you disengage from it, the audience does as well. But if you listen to it, if you're really listening to it until only a trace of it is left, it might not even really be there. The audience still hears it too, I think. So I think our attention as listeners in performance creates a kind of attention for the audience as well, for the listener. And perhaps there's some neuroscience to address that or explain that, or maybe not. Maybe it's just completely something that I've imagined. But I do try to listen consciously and deeply while I perform. And then another part of that, where you began with the embodiment and the physical aspects of it. Uh, for percussionists, I mean, every musician has this deep physical and emotional relationship with their instrument. For percussionists, uh, yeah, our instruments are often large, unwieldy, hard to manage. We have to move to play them. The choreography of performing a piece becomes a part of the piece, like a central part of it. So that kind of dance-like quality is very much like the movements we use to play these instruments, we embody the sound in that way. I think another part of that is that percussionists deal with primary physical materials in a way that I think other musicians don't. The piano, compared to the marimba, even though they have the same keyboard and the notation looks really similar, the piano is this huge and really like highly like mechanical instrument. I mean, it feels like an industrial revolution sort of instrument that all the parts of it couldn't have existed before that. And there are all these degrees to which the pianist is separate from the thing that's actually making sound, and all the touch and refinement you develop on the keyboard. You have this incredibly close and intimate relationship with the keyboard, but the actual sound is being produced by hammers on the strings. And as percussionists, I feel like our approach is to relate to the strings and not the keyboard. So even a marimba, where we have this keyboard and have a technique that's very refined and detailed, each piece of wood has its own life and its own sound and can be taken out of the whole. It's a highly regulated instrument with resonators that are tuned to the bars. And yet sometimes I look at the instrument and I see a bunch of wooden planks and that happen to have been put together. And more, I approach each of those wooden planks as a separate thing that has its own life and qualities and character. So that gets to something of our relationship with the instrument. And then finally, there's a way in which on any instrument, when you bring your body to it, to perform on it, to play on it, to bring it to life, to activate it, you're creating like a transformation happens, both for you and the instrument. You become, you breathe life into the instrument, but you also become something that interacts with it, that resonates with it. A composer that we've, in Talia, who we've worked with quite a lot and who we've performed at the Italian Academy, Pierre Luigi Bologne, his percussion writing is, incredibly tactile. It's things that are scraped on surfaces and exploring those surface textures and all the irregularities. And then with a gong on the chest, pounding on it while also affecting your own voice, things like that. We become the resonators for the instruments. And so there is this, as percussionists, I think, that's maybe an extreme example of it, but I find that in everything I do with an instrument, that it resonates through you as well as you activating it, that you become something new together. There's a transformation.
More on percussive feelings. In 2018, Daniel Levitin, a cognitive psychologist and professor emeritus at McGill University, noted that when we are carried away by music through trance or dance, it is because of the temporal aspects like meter or rhythm, and less often due to spectral aspects such as pitch or harmony. However, he notes something that we all know intuitively, that the spectral aspects affect our perceptions of the temporal ones. So for example, how fast or slow we judge or feel a tempo to be is affected by the density of the music, register of the pitches, and loudness. This is just some things they find with regular listeners that are not musicians. So can you talk a little bit about how you think the colors and textures of 21st century repertoire interact with our perception of basic things like tempo or rhythmic entrainment, which are so fundamental to other music?
Sure. I lost you a little bit there, but I think you're asking, actually, if you could repeat that, I'd appreciate it.
Of course. Can you talk a little bit about how you think the colors and textures of 21st century music interact with our perception of basic things like tempo or rhythm?
Sure. The colors and textures, basic things like tempo and rhythm. Yeah, I'm not sure I've thought about this in any direct way, so I'll try to make my way to it. The colors and textures, I think maybe are, I think in 21st century music, maybe we could say that the color and texture is privileged over other qualities of music in a way that they weren't before. That, in 19th century music, there's an expectation of what the color and texture will be: a piano sonata, a string quartet, an orchestral work. Although the orchestral works, of course, got more and more colorful in their way. And how that interacted with form and then a perception of rhythm and tempo, because you know what to expect, when things will return, you have a good sense of that, then yeah, I think that those things were taken together. When texture and color become more, become more forefronted in music, that might interrupt our sense of it or change our expectations. Maybe like a pop song is an interesting example too. Like a standard pop song, you recognize the group of instruments, guitar, bass, drums, and a singer. You immediately recognize the verse chorus structure, and you have a really good sense of when the next thing's going to happen. And then, of course, if something defies that expectation, that's surprising and exciting. But when you make music out of completely different materials, then you lose those expectations. And then maybe that just opens it up for all kinds of possibilities. There are pieces where, like, I love the first minute and a half of it. Like maybe I'm listening to a recording and there's this like incredibly well-developed line and all these interesting sounds. And then it reaches a point at maybe 1.5 minutes, which is actually a very long time in some ways, to create like this meaningful line. And then you look and you go, oh, there are 9 more minutes to this piece, or maybe 10.5, because, so many pieces are 12 minutes. And you wonder how it will, sustain that or get to it. And sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. But yeah, on the other hand, there are, minimalist works like Steve Reich's music, or really, all kinds of things that expand time, where as you delve into the texture and the granularity of it and the interest of it, and you're not just listening to the pitches, those signal things again, but like immersed in a world of noise where you can almost move around and listen to different qualities of it. You feel like you can move inside of it. Then 5-6 minutes can go by and really very little has happened, but you've barely noticed that passage of time. So yeah, maybe that's where I'll end on this one.
Thank you. So I think that a final little topic of ours is emotional surfaces. Um, so there's kind of a glib association of something like slow tempi with sadness and thoughtfulness, and faster tempi with happiness or excitement. But it's nonetheless interesting that even 5-year-olds make this association. So there seems to be an inherent relationship between timing and emotions. Naturally, Charles Darwin was interested in this, since timing is fundamental to music, music to emotions, and emotions to humans. In chapter 8 of his The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals, he describes laughter as inherently rhythmic. For example, here's a quote of him describing a blind and deaf woman's instincts while laughing. Quote, Laura Bridgman, from her blindness and deafness, could not have acquired any expression through imitation. Yet when a letter from a beloved friend was communicated to her by her gesture language, she laughed and clapped her hands. On other occasions, she was seen to stomp for joy. So we have classical prototypes like the scherzo and other like musical jokes, usually through the rich method of having a listener come to expect things through years of exposure to a canon, and then cleverly deviating from it, often through rhythmic play. This is not what I would consider an emotional surface, however. It's too involved to be considered something like that for me. So my question is, does contemporary percussive music use expectations to incite emotions? And alternatively, what is the gamut of what emotions can be incited without an established syntax? Syntax being like tonality or...
Yeah. So I think as a performer of contemporary percussion music and a listener and one who's immersed in it, I generally don't think of like direct emotional states, like specifically, although the things you mentioned certainly do happen, but but it's not something I think about a lot, because I think that most of the music we play doesn't convey that in a really direct way, although it does create states of like high emotional intensity, but I can't put my finger on what emotion that is. So I think about it more as like levels of emotional intensity, from maybe calmness to something like really agitated and deep, although of course I think that that's up to the listener. I don't necessarily think that music directly conveys any of those things, but I do think that people react very deeply and emotionally to music, and they get certain signals sent their way. Like they have an expectation of how something might sound and affect them by what it looks like. Percussion is very visual, both in the instruments and in what you're doing. When kids see like a bunch of drums, they put their fingers in their ears. They know it's going to be loud, and they know they're going to be running around and the like. But but they might be surprised too. It doesn't necessarily do that. But I think I would also say that I think in earlier music and other types of music too, there is like a clear like idea of what emotions are activated, like what affects one can expect from certain types of music and certain types of structures. And I think that that's a wide open thing in contemporary percussion music. I think that a new syntax is being created, and new responses. And I'm not sure if that'll ever be codified into something that's so clear. Maybe it will, but I think that that's part of the exploration of what we're doing, finding new, like emotive, a new emotive vocabulary for this music.
So do you think there's like more variability in the listener to to percussive music, or this specific time period of percussive music versus something like Schubert? Because you like a lot of research is trying to show patterns, right? Of
Mhm.
like, okay, what do people usually do? So do you think there would be more variance for something like percussion? And maybe it's hard, that's why it's hard to think of like a specific emotion, and you think of it more of a general thing or abstract thing.
I'm not Yeah, I'm not sure. And I don't know what a listener in Schubert's time would make of contemporary percussion music. I mean, it'd be funny
Hmm.
to see. Uh, of course, it should be said that I'm sure I don't hear Schubert the way listeners in the time of
Hmm.
Schubert heard Schubert. I'm sure that I hear sure, huh? It's hard to say sure and Schubert. It's going to come out anyway. But yeah, you know, I don't hear it. My ears are just very different. My ears listen for different things, and I probably can't appreciate it in the way a contemporaneous listener would have appreciated Schubert, because my ears aren't developed to hear that. But I hear other things. An example I like to give is um, an important piece in my life is Mahler's Das Lied von der Erde, which I played in college. And I remember the opening of the sixth movement. I was playing the tam tam, and it's being doubled by all these low instruments, you know, double bass, I think contra, bassoon, harp, all playing in unison. And the first two attacks are together, and then there's just this sound. And then the third measure, there's another attack followed by the oboe melody. And I just wanted to disappear into those attacks, and I was less interested in that melody. And so it's just to say that my ears have developed to be interested in different things. But whether, yeah, specifically to your question, I think that a lot of contemporary percussion music, not all of it. I mean, some of it is very rhythmic and regular in certain ways, but the complexity of the sounds, the non-standardization of the sounds, the fact that every cymbal is different, every drum is different, all these resonances are different in a really profound way, means that, you know, pattern and expectation are not as much. Pattern is certainly a part of it, but regularity is not as much a part of it. There's so much that can be different with each performance, with each listening. Um,
Are
that
you
maybe that
saying are you saying that patterns are sort of a big part of why emotions can be specified in other music?
Maybe I'm not sure. I mean, this is I maybe just asking a question here because I surely don't have an answer to that. But I think it is part of it. Again, like the expectation in a pop song of when things happen and what they do, the the delight when it's done really well and you arrive at that, or the surprise when it's subverted. Those things are all, you know, have to do with pattern. And even like again on a granular level, there's a regularity to you know, the vibrations of you know, percussion instruments vibrate in an irregular way. So like even on this deep pattern level, there's something that's less expected or less you know, regular. So I don't know, maybe people have a standard set of emotional responses to percussion music, or maybe they don't. I can't speak for the listener, but for me, I don't find those more easily identifiable emotions connected to things. There's another way in which, you know, maybe storytelling can be associated with music or not. Like some music has the form of a story, of a narration, um, or or the like, which teaches you how to respond to it. You develop a set of responses, and most of the music I play doesn't have that kind of narrative. But at the same time, sometimes that's a really lyrical quality that can give you like a reaction of just feeling, you know, beauty or some sense of peace or resolution. Like there are basic emotional things that we certainly feel with percussion music.
Sorry about the difficult question. It came
No, it's
about. It's because the Darwin that I mentioned before, it like
yeah.
he talks about laughter, and that was very obvious as a rhythmic thing. But then devotion was sort of like, okay, it was interesting to ask where devotion is from a percussive perspective, and like, and I saw a musicologist describe a Schubert sonata as devotional. So I was like, okay, this is a common thing. It's not just like somebody just used the word once for music. It's like and it doesn't have to be Catholic religious music. It's a way that people describe some feelings in music. So that's why I thought of it. It would be interesting to ask you how it could connect or how it couldn't connect to percussion.
Sure. So what do you mean by devotion?
So Actually, Darwin actually doesn't even provide a sufficient musical explanation. I don't think people really do provide sufficient explanations. It's just they kind of write what they feel, but for some reason there's a pattern of people using this word. So Darwin talks about like kneeling and looking up at the sky, and that's devotion, but he doesn't really bring it into the musical perspective, even though this chapter has a lot of interplay with emotions and music. And then about the sonata I was reading is Paul Skoda referred to a 4/3 suspension in Schubert's piano sonata as devotional. Maybe that's because of some relativeness to like another theme or how the theme was developed, but still that could be an answer to why it's not as common in percussion music. I don't know about thematic progression and or manipulation in percussive music.
Well, actually, let me just say, I apologize if you brought up devotion in your previous question. You were cutting in and out, and I might have missed that.
Oh,
But I'm glad you brought it back to that. So I'll try to respond to that and say, I'm not sure that I would experience devotion. I think you asked about like embodying devotion while playing. And I don't know if that's the same as it is in Schubert, but maybe my answer to that, my subjective experience of that would be, it is really powerful and feels something like devotion to be making a sound that's bigger than you and that kind of takes you over. If you think of like bells and devotional music, and it's, of course we have an association with them, like we hear that and we go, oh, bells, devotional music. But I think there's a reason that bells are used in that. And when you're around them, when you're in the building with them, when they're like vibrating your body, that's a really powerful, powerful thing. And I feel devotion in things like that. I think that when I'm playing an instrument and I feel it take on its own life, when a tam-tam starts to ring and like all these overtones are coming out and it seems to have its own power, or you're playing drum set and you're doing a set of actions and yet there's so much sound happening and so much complexity and interest to it and noise, and you feel yourself a part of that. You don't even feel like you're playing it, like you're resonating inside of it. That to me feels like devotion. And I think that's something very, very powerful in percussion. We
great
have many
answer.
devotional instruments like singing bowls and things, that are used specifically for that. But even the singing bowl, like the magic of it is that you're doing very little and all the sound comes out and it just feels like, yeah, it becomes more than you and takes you over. And yeah, that would be my experience of that.
Thank you for that answer. And finally, more subjective of a question too. In this piece that you prepared for us, what is there any emotion you can think of, or emotions that you can think of that are a great part of it, or that we may feel?
I think so. You may have discerned that I don't know that I don't speak that clearly about emotion. I think that in some ways, this goes back to Cage, who told us, that there is no emotion in music, or no, the emotion is in the listener, not in the music, but it's also in the performer as well. And then how that gets conveyed. But I tend to think about like materials, the way they act, the sounds they make, and like, the depth of sound. And incidentally, a thunderstorm is brewing outside my studio right now, so we may get some of that. But not specifically in terms of like emotions I'm trying to generate. And you asked about like, I think like emotional surfaces. And, I'm not sure directly how to address that either, but I think about surface in percussion a lot. And again, like the physical material quality of percussion instruments, the way when you move across the surface, you discover all these sounds through those textures, the way you get past the signal of it, which might just be striking it, to the noise of it, where you explore like these surface noises, and then everything that's like kind of embedded in that. So the piece that you will hear that I prepared for you is a piece by Carolyn Chen, and the title is The Great Burnham Wood, and it is for drum set. And I thought of that doing this piece specifically because it deals a lot with some of the things we've talked about, with the surfaces of the instruments, the skins, the textures of them, the sounds that are made when things move along them. And it's a piece in which a lot of sound is created through actions that you are not necessarily directly manipulating. So there are marbles on the drum heads, marbles inside bowls, things spinning, things that are put into motion. You drop, one marble and then more into a salad bowl and get those moving, and then they start resonating on a head. And so there are all these ways in which you're creating sound by interacting with the granular surface features of the instruments, and also putting things into motion that take on a life of their own. And so then you, as the performer, become subsumed by that, and something is happening beyond you. So I don't know what emotion that is, but that's the emotional state for me. I find the piece to be very intense to play in a really positive way. I find it to be like a release too, that you go to a place and let things go. And that is something that can subsume you, because as these things go into motion, first you're exploring them, but then they take on their own life and you're going along with it. And so it's a very powerful emotion, but what specific emotion that is, I leave to the listener.
Thank you so much, Matt.
Thank you.